Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Epicenter Podcast with Trey Goff and Max Medina. Joining us today is Tom Murcott. He is an executive director for Próspera and a colleague and friend to both Max and I. Tom served in the EVP positions of both the Chief Marketing Officer and later the Global Foreign Investment Officer at Gale International. In that role, Tom was tasked with bringing investors and residents to the Songdo International Business District in South Korea, which is a 1,500-acre, $35 billion smart, sustainable city rising in Incheon, South Korea. Tom was also a leader on the Joint Master Plan Development Task Force for the 1,700-acre Meixi Lake Eco City project in Changsha, Hunan province in the People's Republic of China. So Tom, more so than pretty much anyone else that I've met, has a ton of experience building new centers of prosperity, which is primarily what we're going to be talking about today. So with that, Tom, welcome to the Epicenter.
Thanks, Trey. Max, it's great to be here.
Welcome. Hey, Tom, I find Songdo fascinating as both an architectural project and a human achievement. Could you tell us the full story of your involvement in Songdo and how you became to that?
And by the way, feel free to go into as much detail as you want here. I'd love to hear the story of kind of how Songdo became Songdo.
Sure. Well, Songdo started really back in the 1980s when Korea was really a manufacturing hub, but was becoming a very industrialized country and started to export a lot of its actual manufacturing and industrial services outside of the country. And by the 1990s, and then when the Asian financial crisis hit, they realized that they had exported a large part of their economy elsewhere in the world. Yet they had a very strategic location in Northeast Asia, sort of sandwiched between China and Russia and Japan. And yet it was not a business destination for foreign investment. So they began in earnest to set aside a plan for development that would create a global destination for international commerce. And they started that by reclaiming some land between two islands in the West Sea, whereby they built the Incheon International Airport, which is, I think, now the third busiest airport in Asia, and was going to be sort of the initial hub around which this other development would take place. And what they decided to do was to try and find a cadre of international investors and designers, master planners, who could come in and develop this reclaimed land that they were reclaiming off the west coast of the Seoul of the Korean Peninsula, just outside Seoul. And that total land reclamation was about 15,000 acres. And the development that Gale International, the firm that I was working on, which was to be the International Business District, which would become known as Songdo, was about 1,500 acres. So the total project cost for not the airport, which was separate, but to reclaim that land, and then for us to build out our development on top of the infrastructure that the government put into the ground was about $35 billion. And the reason why they chose Gale is because we had been in a fairly small company, but had developed some quite large-scale projects in the United States, everything from shopping centers to office parks to 5,000-unit residential tract housing. So we had a very good portfolio of mixed-use asset development. And to a certain extent, I think we were the only folks in, I think it was about 2000 or 2001, when calls went out from Korea to international developers, predominantly in the US, to come and develop in Korea. Business was actually still pretty good here at that time before the dot-bomb crash. And we decided that it would be an interesting thing. We had just wrapped up some large projects here in the US, an interesting opportunity to go take a look at what they were doing. We flew out to Korea, the team did, and our chairman, Stan Gale, was invited by the mayor to go up in a helicopter and fly over what was then a barren tidal basin. And the mayor said, do you see it, Mr. Gale? And he said, well, I'm a pretty visionary guy, Mr. Mayor, but there's nothing here. I don't see it. And at which point the mayor began to discuss and lay out the vision that the Korean people had to create a engine of economic vitality, a place where literally hundreds of thousands of jobs would be created, where people would come to open new businesses where international businesses would come and establish headquarters. And they were willing to make the significant multi-billion-dollar investment to put the land reclamation, the infrastructure, et cetera, and so on in place. And that was sort of where it all began. And from there, we just began to bring in our various different partners and begin the development in earnest.
Got it. That makes sense. And so did they do a kind of public request for proposal where a bunch of people bid and then Gale ended up being the developer? Or was it more like they kind of courted you guys and said, we want Gale to do this and sweet talked you into it, so to speak?
Well, they went after a variety of different potential partners to come in and do this. I think Gale was one of the few companies that was bold enough to say, real estate development is a fairly parochial business, right? So to say you're going to pick up and go to another city is challenging enough within the United States. To say you're going to pick up and go to another country and develop a city that had never really been done before as an exercise, well, that's a bigger leap of faith. And so I don't know exactly how many people that they took up in that helicopter, but we may have been the only ones who came down and said yes and signed the letter of intent, and then ultimately went ahead and invested, decades, a decade plus, working to build Songdo out. So certainly many, and then of course we brought in a cadre of international partners from architectural design firms, master planners, engineering firms, et cetera, to help us, do this work. We were sort of the maestro for this orchestra that we brought together to build out this, what would become this really international city.
Ray, I would like to talk about the intangible world of Songdo, about the improvements of governance, or any special economic zones that these Songdo represents. So this project, it's similar to Dubai or something. What is your perspective in this? What Songdo is, how was the Songdo governance improvements that they bring into the table?
So this is a public-private partnership led by the Korean central government, as well as the Incheon metropolitan city municipal government. And then the free economic zone had its own governing authority, which was the Incheon Free Economic Zone Authority, IFEZA. And the free economic zone functioned similarly to many special economic zones around the world, where there were certain tax incentives for certain industry sectors. There were certain regulatory benefits, certain investment thresholds that needed to be met, certain tax benefits that were provided as a result of that. I think where Songdo didn't achieve its full potential is that it didn't go far enough in the level of autonomy and regulatory freedom that it granted, in that it wasn't truly as competitive as it was with other special economic zones that were either in the region or in places like you mentioned, Max, like in Dubai, where income tax might be zero. Our income tax was 25%. So we didn't necessarily across the board have the competitive regulatory and special economic zone mandates that would allow us to be as competitive as we could be to certain special economic zones in China or to Singapore or to Dubai or other places where companies might want to come and set up shop. That said, it did function separate from the Korean traditional model, in that there were certain dispensations, but at the end of the day, it largely was sort of a Korea-driven regulatory environment. And I think that in the long term, that will be one thing that might hold Songdo back a bit from attracting more foreign investment. While it didn't attract a significant amount, it will detract from being able to attract more foreign investment in the future, unless that regulatory framework is lessened on some fashion.
Got it. That makes sense. And then how did funding work for this project? You mentioned it was a $35 billion development. Was that mostly kind of debt and equity from Gale's side, or was the Korean government helping fund part of this? How did that work?
Well, the infrastructure was largely funded by the government, municipal bonds, et cetera, and so on. So, and then different structures were funded through different mechanisms, whether it was the bridge that was built for about $850 million across the 24 kilometers that it took to get from the airport to our development site. We put that bridge in our contract. We said, well, if you want to have a special economic zone, it has to be very close to the airport. And the existing trip to the airport was about an hour and 15 minutes to get from the airport to where this land was going to be reclaimed. We said, you need a bridge. So they said, oh, great. Well, let's get some municipal bonds out there and let's get this bridge funded. That's how that was funded. Our individual and then there was a facility loan that we took out for initially, I think about $1.7 billion. And then that was ramped up to about $2.4 billion on land acquisition and some modest infrastructure. The majority of the infrastructure that was going in, though, was funded by the government, by the central government. And then project financing was done by whomever was managing that particular project. So we might go out to the investment banking community, REITs, et cetera, and so on, to build the skyscraper that, if you're watching this video on YouTube, is right behind Trey's head there. That's the NEAT Tower, Northeast Trade Tower. And that had some folks like JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley and others, coming in to make that investment. And Gale was the sort of lead developer on that particular project. So each project was somewhat different, and there was a whole range of different types of investors who were participating in Songdo, given its size and scale.
Wow, and what was your role, especially within this development, Tom? What were you personally focused on?
So my responsibility was really to bring global foreign investment into the development. So I spent a lot of my time traveling the world, letting people know about the good news about Korea, about what Songdo was intending to do and was in fact accomplishing. And then we would then bring them to see this brand new place. At the beginning, it wasn't so easy because there was nothing but dirt and some land that was being reclaimed. So there was a lot of education that went on in the early stages. But over time, as we started to have actual square footage available and different types of asset classes available, it was easier to go and pitch a hotel or a commercial occupier or a residential tower developer to want to come in and actually build on the development. And our team was really the international face of Songdo. So we acted almost as sort of the chamber of commerce, if you will, for Songdo. And then our job was to bring them in, and then the team on the ground in Korea would negotiate and close the deal for whatever the specific investment, partnership, development, project development was going to be.
Got it. That makes sense. And relatedly, this next question is kind of a two-part question. What was kind of the main selling point of Songdo for some of these tenants? And then, so like those are the ones that kind of proved successful and ended up moving in, deals that closed. And then relatedly, there had been some press in like 2017, 2018 that tried, as we know, bad news sells better than good news, that tried to paint Songdo as like not completely fulfilling its potential. It only attracted 100,000 residents in 10 years instead of 300,000 or whatever. So both what was kind of successful, like what made Songdo work? I mean, you have some great tenants like University of New York, George Mason University, IBM, Cisco, whole bunch of awesome international firms. So it was successful to a point. And then what kind of created that impression, or what do you think maybe held Songdo back and that caused some of that press that said like, look, this worked, but it didn't work fully?
Well, answer the first part of your question, which is what draws people to a development, and what draws people to any place, right? It's really quality of life. And if you can't offer me a better quality of life or better, more productive working circumstance or a good burger from time to time, right? Then I'm not coming, right? So what we had to do was actually build a place that had the social, cultural, fabric that people would want to go and live in and spend time in and work in. And if we couldn't offer them a better place to live, work, play, then they weren't coming. So what we set out to do when we first did our development, which was kind of interesting, when we showed the master plan, and again, behind you, Trey, is leading up to that beautiful tower is a 100-acre park. And in Korea, the general development aesthetic was, or sort of programmatic was that, build it high and put as many buildings in there as you can. There's some in the background in that image that you have that aren't ours, which are big, huge towers, and they're 40, 60 stories tall, and they all look exactly the same. And there's no real concern about the development that's around it, the quality of life. So we said, when we showed our initial plans to some of our Korean partners, they said, "What, are you crazy? You've got this empty piece of land in the middle of the development." And we said, no, think about the greatest cities in the world. Where is the most valuable land in any major city in the world? Where it's around a park. It's around Central Park. It's around, it's around all these beautiful places where people can go and decompress. So while you might have density all around that park, you need to have a place where people can go and congregate and play and throw a ball around, and then you need to have great restaurants. And so what we set out to do was to create a place which would become a destination that was as appealing as any great city in the world. And that's ultimately what attracted these companies to come to Songdo. In the early stages, we had some folks come in who were our partners, who were going to do a significant amount of business and put a lot of their product into our development. So that might be Otis Elevator, or it might be Cisco, or it might be others. But at the end of the day, what they found out was there are people who were coming down sort of kicking and screaming from Seoul or from somewhere else in the region. Once we had all this infrastructure built out and the park was operating, we had great restaurants and we had nightlife and we had walking trails, et cetera, and so on. They loved it. It was better than Seoul. So we didn't have to sell at that point. They were, those people living there were our best sales folks. So that was sort of what we had to build out. In terms of how people portrayed Songdo, and throughout the process, there was people saying, well, it's just not, it's empty. It's a ghost town. At the beginning, that was true. There wasn't many people there. And quite frankly, depending on which way you turned the camera and took the picture, if you were taking it towards the buildings that were built, against the existing mainland, well, there's lots of buildings there. If you turn the camera the other way, there's still land being reclaimed. So the issue was, how do you make sure that when people arrive, they feel the power and the pull of the place? And good news stories have a protagonist usually in them, right? So it's easy. You typically want to say that this guy's not successful, and he's not successful because this bad thing is happening over here. What they choose, or they lose the focus on all the good things that are happening if they were just to turn the camera in the other direction and say, look at these families playing in the park. Look at all these good things that are happening. It doesn't make as great a story as to say, well, they spent billions of dollars and nobody showed up. Well, that's not true. And the 100,000 people that they said were in Songdo was only because that was how many apartment buildings and office spaces were built at that particular time. And there were literally hundreds of thousands of additional people in the buildings right outside of our development that were part of greater Songdo, that weren't accounted for in that particular article, the one that you were referencing. So it's a balancing act when you're working with the media. Tell the true story, but also make sure that it's a balanced story so that you're telling the truth of what's actually happening in the greater good of the actual circumstance.
Well, that's amazing, and I love that you talk about the architecture of the space. When you combine nature with this city concept, it became something really, really cool. And talking about architecture firms, I would love to know if you work with some architecture firm that is recognized, and what is your experience with the architecture firms? Because I will be honest, you're a very popular man. I know a lot of architects, famous architects, that know you. Actually, the last time that we went to New York, Bjarke recognized you, and that was like amazing. What's your experience with architecture firms?
Well, we needed a lot of help. So we started actually with Cohn Pedersen Fox, KPF, as our lead master plan architect. But we knew it wouldn't be just one architectural firm, right? We needed to have a pastiche of different styles, of different aesthetic, of different design attitudes. So KPF was helping us to do the master plan, and they also did several buildings. They did that neat tower I was just referencing behind Trey there. But we also had Daniel Liebskin was involved. He did the mall. We had Kling Stubbins. We had HOK. we had a whole host of different design firms. And of course, cadres of Korean engineering, design, et cetera, firms who were helping with the actual on-the-ground architectural design and execution. But I would say sort of the core team was KPF, Arup, and then just a whole host of other providers who joined that effort. And they were really all in. I mean, they were doing a lot of development in this part of the world, but they weren't really doing city scale development. It hadn't been really a thing yet. So I think what intrigued KPF and Gene Cohn at the time, Jamie Von Klemper, and some of the other members of their team was this real huge opportunity to create an entire city from scratch. And then we went out and we hired Jack Nicklaus, to do our golf course. And Jack did a great job. And as Stan Gale used to like to say, we gave Jack an unlimited budget and he exceeded it. So it was a really exciting time. When everybody was so thrilled about what we were doing, and to be able to sort of see it all work together was pretty amazing.
I have a related question to that, and then a follow-up. But so if you guys are kind of, as you described it, the maestros, making sure all of this goes together well and flows together well, but you have a bunch of different architectural and design and engineering firms working together. What kind of gave it a cohesive aesthetic? Because if you go on Google Street View, for instance, and you go look around in Songdo, it all looks, both the buildings are different. There's a diversity of design and aesthetic, but it all fits into one broader motif or aesthetic. Were you guys responsible for that, or were the design firms just kind of in a decentralized way, just happened to coordinate with one another? Or how did that work? How did you make sure that it had a cohesive aesthetic? Because what it doesn't look like Houston, for instance, which I love, which has basically no planning or zoning or anything like that. But you'll see like a mom and pop small restaurant next to a 20-story apartment building, for instance, which doesn't bother me, but does bother some people. You don't have that in Songdo. So how did that work? How did you make sure there was a cohesive, coherent design aesthetic and motif?
Well, that was really a team effort. I mean, that was working with Cohen Patterson Fox. It was working with Arup. It was working with our other architectural design partners, but really led by Gale with the direction of these amazing architecture and engineering firms to say, okay, we've got this plot of land, right, 1,500 acres, pretty much a big rectangle for the most part, and it's got a front which is attached to the mainland, right, where there's already buildings, and then it's got a back which is where the golf course is going to be, and then there's all this stuff that's going to go in between. What we did was we sort of put a central park right in the middle. We put a beautiful canal right down the middle of it, and that led up to the tallest building, which is what's in that image behind you, Trey, which is the Northeast Asia Trade Tower, which for a period of time was the tallest building in Korea. And then we built sort of a canopy that came down like this, right? So it starts with a lot of density right around this little park, 105 acre park. And then the buildings start to come down as you go out towards the golf course. And then a little less so as you go towards the mainland because there's taller buildings there already. But so that sort of informed the level of density and the plot FAR, floor area ratios, et cetera, and so on, that we were going to put in to each of these plots of land. So we were quite prescriptive about what you could build there and how you had to build it, and that you should ideally build it to a USGBC LEED certification standard. But there was enough flexibility so the actual aesthetic of the building could change, right? So each building didn't look the same as the next, right? And then we had certain other components where we had lots of pocket parks, right? So we were 40% open and green space. We wanted to make sure that we didn't have too much density. And we made sure that there was always public transportation no longer than about 8 to 10 minutes away from any residence or business in Songdo, so that we encouraged people to take public transportation. And it was very well thought through. And we had subway stations that were pulled into our development from Seoul, so people didn't have to get in their car and drive. So there was a lot of very, very diligent advanced planning that went into making sure that the long-term success and aesthetic of the actual place was going to be really quite beautiful and very functional.
Got it. I love the forethought that went into that. It fits very well into what I've both read and learned in conversation with the famous urban planner, Elaine Berteau. He talks about reducing travel times as making the density of the labor markets in cities denser and therefore much more kind of effective and fluid and dynamic. So you guys nailed that pretty much. And then I had a kind of related thought and question on this. And I usually ask anyone that comes on the podcast who's worked on a big scale development before this question, because it remains one of the biggest open questions in my mind. And that's the kind of the chicken or egg problem. So you have one school of thought that says, if you build it, they will come. So you plan ahead of time, you master plan, you start construction, and you start trying to pre-sell and get anchor tenants and get some tenants as you're building. But you built it before you ever nailed down a tenant effectively, or started building and had the designs before you ever nailed down a tenant. And you have another school of thought that is quite the opposite, which says find the tenants first, sell them your vision with like a very rudimentary master plan, and then basically use their feedback and their thoughts to build to spec effectively what they need. The latter was what happened in the DIFC. They already had, from Chirac's previous work and a few others, a ton of connections in the finance industry. And the DIFC had one of the best regulatory environments in the world for finance. They had a completely custom regulatory environment thanks to their special economic zone. So they were able to find the tenants kind of beforehand, build the first few office buildings, get them in there, and then build to suit finance firms specifically because they knew that was the tenants they were going to have. So how did you guys solve the chicken or egg problem? Did you build first, then get tenants, or did you get tenants and then build? And how'd you go about that?
Well, really, again, as I said, this started back in the 80s, right? When Korea made a commitment to spend significant amount of their taxpayer dollars to build a place, to build the airport, to reclaim the land, to build an international business district that would become Songdo and all the development that goes on around it and that big 15,000 acre plot of land that's there. So they made a commitment and they stayed the course, right? Through multiple presidential administrations, multiple mayoral administrations, they kept building, reclaiming, putting in the infrastructure, the roads, the bridge, all the things that they needed to do to build this world-class place. Then went out and got Gale and other developers and whatnot to come in and do the development on this land that was being reclaimed. And then it was incumbent upon the developer and their partners to go out and find these occupiers, right? And it was a lot easier once you had 100 million square foot built out and a central park and great restaurants and a place to go out and have a beer at night than it was when you had buildings coming up out of the ground and said, imagine what your headquarters would look like here, IBM or Chase Bank or you know other folks who were doing business in the region. And so I would say, though, we did a little bit of both, right? So we had our public sector partner who went out and said, if we build it, they will come. And then the people who, like us, said, okay, if we build it this certain way, we can target these particular tenants and occupiers, and we can handcraft a particular circumstance for them. So, for example, when the Green Climate Fund was putting their headquarters out to bid to say, where are we going to put the Green Climate Fund, which is going to be this climate finance arm spun out of the UN. And we knew that all the other firms that were going to be sort of circling around, the lending institutions, the lawyers, the accountants, et cetera, and so on, if we could land a Green Climate Fund headquarters, and we were up against, I think, Prague and Budapest and a number of other places around the world that were quite attractive, Geneva, Switzerland. And so we sold them on Korea because it was in Asia where there was a lot of development going on at that particular time. And they came, we put them in a particular building that actually the metropolitan government built. And then all those other ancillary companies came and opened up shop and they took space in our development. And another example, which was done by the Korean government, is they were fortunate enough that Samsung was wanting to get into the life sciences business. They're very successful in semiconductors and electronics and whatnot. And they realized that, well, making a biosimilar is a lot like making a semiconductor chip, right? You just pump them out and you make a lot of them and you ship them. And so they invested billions of dollars in developing 3 or 4 plants that were adjacent to our development site where they were creating these biosimilar products in conjunction with a U.S. Contract research organization called Quintiles. And as a result, they got the tax benefits and they were able to open up that development. And all of the workers and the knowledge workers, et cetera, and so on, who were working in those plants were now taking space in our residential developments and whatnot. So you have to be very, how should we say, programmatic about how you go about attracting these various different industries and think broadly about not just that particular occupier, but what else are they going to be able to bring to the table in terms of everybody who's going to be supporting their business model.
Very briefly, what kind of tenants did you target? What specific industry, or just anyone who was interested in coming?
Well, it was really everything, Max. I mean, we had to have tailors and dry cleaners, and we needed to have restaurants, and we needed to have retail, and we needed to have a shopping center, and we needed to have commercial occupiers, we needed to have hoteliers, and we needed to have, got people who rented gondolas on the canal. And obviously we weren't selling to gondola renters, gondoliers on the canal. That was open to the people who had the park. But my point is that, we were targeting financial institutions. We were looking at folks who wanted, like Samsung, other large Korean based firms that were going to potentially come in. And that was where some of the challenges came from a special economic zone perspective, in that the Korean firms were not being offered the same incentives to relocate to the zone because they were Korean. They wanted foreign firms to come in. And the point Gale constantly made to the government was, no, you've got to give a thriving business environment, generally speaking, for others in the international community to want to come and put a new investment in a new place, or even to move their business from Seoul out to Songdo. There has to be a thriving business community there already. So our partner, POSCO, moved their headquarters into Songdo immediately, and again moved about, 10 or 12,000 people somewhat reluctantly from Seoul into residential that was there, only to find that they actually loved the quality of life there, because there was a park and there were great schools and there was good restaurants, et cetera. And then the word spread and other firms started to come, and then we would target very strategically. Standard Chartered Bank might want to do a headquarter location in a low-rise, development project over on one parcel of land, or IBM might want to do a data center over here. So we did a lot of work with folks like JLL and others who were sort of big, large brokerage firms who were active in the region and knew where people's real estate needs were evolving. And so we had a whole host, but there was no asset class or different type of occupier that went unnoticed or unconsidered by us as we went out and tried to grow this out.
Makes sense. It's kind of fulfilling the old cliche, beggars can't be choosers. We need people, and we got to attract people. Totally get it. A bit of a more kind of personal question for your personal motivations, Tom. Our listeners won't know this, but Max and I do well, and perhaps I even more than Max, having spent a little more time with you. You've put an enormous amount of work and time and effort into advancing Próspera's project to create prosperity for Hondurans. What motivated you to work first with Gale on such a seemingly daunting project as Songdo? And what drives you now to work so passionately and put so much time and effort into the Próspera project?
Well, when I came to the Gale project, in I think 2007, 2008, I had just left a firm that I co-founded in New York City, and I got a call from Stan, who I knew, and he was building this secret. He was a very ebullient fellow, and he said, "Tommy, I'm building this city in Korea. I need an Olympic-sized marketing campaign." He knew I was in marketing, and I said, "Well, how much money do you have, Stan?" And he told me, and I said, "Well, you don't quite have Olympic money, but let me see if we can put something together for you." And so I did that, and I brought in my old firm, and we did some branding work for him, et cetera, and it was really fun. But I had always intended to go back and start another marketing services firm or do something else like that. But the more I learned about Songdo, and the more I saw what Gale was undertaking, and the truly transformative effect that this was going to have on the lives of literally millions of people, that one morning in early 2008, I woke up and sort of turned to my wife, Paul, and said, what marketing guy worth his salt wouldn't want to sort of help develop a city, right, from scratch, and help brand it and help occupy it. And so that was what intrigued me about that. So in January of 2008, I signed on full time with Gale. And it was about 3 years later that, 3 or 4 years later, I guess, 3 years, that a contingent from a delegation from Honduras showed up, President Lobo. And they were looking at these special economic zones in Asia and elsewhere around the world to try and see how might we bring foreign investment to Honduras. And we squired them around and showed them the development. And they actually asked us if we would come over and work on one of these charter cities. They called them charter cities then in Honduras. And we were quite busy in Korea. So we said we wished them well, but said we couldn't come. And then about 7 or 8 years later, I was beginning to wind things down at Gale. And I got a call from an economist friend of mine, Shankar Singham, who said, I think you should meet these guys who are doing this special economic zone development in Honduras. And I said, well, I've been to this movie once and didn't, I think I just need to see how it ends. And that was when I met Eric and you, Trey, and Rodrigo and Gabe and the rest of the members of the Próspera team, now Max, and we're growing by the day with some really passionate and brilliant people who want to make a difference. And that's why I'm so passionate about this. Is I've been to Honduras. I've seen the work ethic of the Honduran people, how wonderful they are to work with, what a beautiful place it is, particularly Roatan, where we're starting our development, but Honduras as a country in general. And as I look at these places around the world, and I looked at a lot of them when I was with Gale, all over the world. And where else is this type of development needed more than in the developing world? And if we can build, which we're going to, if we can build an engine, a platform for prosperity that works in Honduras, and it's going to work, it's going to transform the lives, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people in the region. And it's going to be a model for development elsewhere in emerging economies. So that's why I've dedicated so much of my time at this point in my life to working with the team. And I see the passion, I see the dedication, and I believe that what we're doing will have a transformative effect on the world at large, starting in Honduras.
Wow, that's very passionate, Tom. And I would like to introduce and talk more about this concept of charter city. Here in Honduras and in Latin America, we call it Ciudad Modelo. Songdo was pretty similar to one Ciudad Modelo. And actually, to be honest, a lot of Hondurans are a little bit scared of this concept. Is Próspera Ciudad Modelo in your eyes, or what Próspera make different about your development in Songdo?
Anything new and that goes against the status quo or the known and accepted has its detractors, and usually more detractors than it does supporters, particularly until it proves itself. And I think that the Ciudad Modelo model, as it's viewed and perceived in Honduras, is built because others have tried and done it poorly or done it wrongly, right? So what our approach is, we're going to build a platform for prosperity. We're going to put the appropriate rule of law, the appropriate regulatory environment, the appropriate physical space, the appropriate infrastructure, and we're going to start with job creation. If we start with, this is about creating jobs for Hondurans, and if that's our benchmark, if that's our starting point, everything else that we do is informed by that. By doing this, are we going to have a net positive effect on the life of a Honduran? Are we going to create a job for them? Are we going to bring economic vitality into their community? Are we going to give them better health care? Are they going to have better access to education, to clean water, to whatever the case may be? So I think where we're different is we're starting by building the platform first, and not by just saying, oh, it's going to be a place, right? It will be a place because that's how it's going to be built out. But at the end of the day, it's the operating system upon which we're building this, and the solid underpinning of job creation, community integration that is at the very fundamental basis of the Próspera model. And only if we stay true to that will we be successful. So Ciudad Modelo, I can understand why many folks would be able to say, oh, this is just another one of those. But if you look a little deeper, that's not our model. We are a solid platform to create prosperity for tens of thousands, millions of people in the long run.
I love the definition.
Yeah, that was a perfect answer.
So I think the difference between a Ciudad Modelo and Próspera is that we are a platform for prosperity. We intend to bring wealth and create jobs for Hondurans. And we are a platform upon which we can build opportunity for others to come in and invest in Honduras and then create jobs for those Hondurans who want to work at home. They don't want to leave their country. They want to have a good, high-paying job in their community. So our goal is to create this place on an operating system that we call Próspera, that's going to create opportunities for Hondurans, that is not a charter city, that is not a Ciudad Modelo, that is not some of what the perceived bad executions or bad programmatic places have been, but we are a wholly new way of doing business and creating opportunity, jobs, and economic vitality for the country of Honduras.
Tom, I know that you have been in Honduras many times. What do you think about Honduras and Roatan in particular?
I think Honduras is an amazing place. I've been to Tegus, I've been to Ceiba, I've been to San Pedro Sula. I've met the people who are wonderful. I've met many folks from the region who are also participating in our development, who are passionate about what they're doing. I've met people in the local indigenous communities that are right next to our development, who want more out of life. They want to have more opportunity. They want to have clean water. They want to have a better education for their children, and they're willing to contribute. They're willing to work for that. This is not someone who says, okay, what's in it for me? To say, how can I help? And what we want to do is we want to provide this place where they can come and participate in the benefit that we're going to create with them, not for them, with them, to build engines of opportunity for people in Honduras who want to contribute and want to help and want to have the best possible job and want to have the best quality of life for their family. And that's what we're setting out to do. And so I love coming to Roatan. It is an absolutely beautiful place. Max, you live there now. I'm so jealous. And it's just amazing. You get off the airplane, you're like, paradise, right? And to be able to be in a place like Roatan, and then also to be able to go to Tegus and have that energy, ramped up, the big city or San Pedro or Ceiba. So I think what's cool, and of course you got the mountains and the beaches there, and the great food. And it's easy to get to, there's an international airport in the circumstance of Roatan that's right there. So I think it has all the ingredients for anybody who wants to open a business in an amazing central location, right between the Americas. I mean, you can't get any more squarely in the middle between North, South, and then Central and Latin America. And what a great location. All we need to do is put a place where there's a business environment that people can come in and businesses can come in and they can live and they can work and they can recreate and really just have an amazing quality of life right there in Honduras, starting with Roatan Próspera.
I love it, Tom. I could not have described it better myself why I love getting up and working every day. That's absolutely perfect. I'm going to close, Tom, with a question that I ask every guest that I stole directly from Tim Ferriss because I thought it was very insightful and I always enjoy the answers to this. Let's imagine for a moment that you could put whatever you wanted, words, phrase, images, whatever you want, on every single billboard in the world for a day. What would you put on that billboard? What would you tell everyone?
Love thy neighbor. If you could love thy neighbor like you love yourself, then the world will be a better place. And that to me is what life is about, right? If you can think more about that other person, if you can think about how do I love the people around me more so than I love myself, then everything will be just fine.
Awesome. I love it. That's a great
That's
one.
beautiful. That's beautiful. That's a great ending.
Awesome. Well, we really appreciate it, Tom. Thanks so much for joining us. And this has been the Epicenter Podcast.
Thanks, guys.